My wife's casket had barely settled into the earth when my son called the funeral home caterer to ask why they were still charging by the hour. I inherited a shoebox of old photographs and a note that said, "Sell what you can, Dad." My children inherited her $42 million logistics empire, the warehouses, the fleet, the distribution contracts, the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive. I got a folder of family photos and a post-it. Mocked in front of the family lawyer, told the house needed to go on the market by spring. I drove to a Motel 6 off I-90 that night and sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like bleach, staring at that shoebox like it might explain itself. Underneath the photographs, taped to the bottom, was a single key and an address in Ohio. And when I drove out there 3 days later, I understood that my children had just handed away the one thing that actually mattered. Before I get into it, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I read every one of your comments. I promise you that. And if you've ever been the one who built something with your own two hands only to watch someone else take the credit, hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to hear how this one ends. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 61 years old, and until 11 days ago, I thought I understood my own family. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you know who Diane was. My wife built Kessler Freight Solutions from a single lease box truck in 1998. I was driving for a competitor back then. 60-hour weeks, coming home smelling like diesel and asphalt, and Diane was doing the books at our kitchen table with a calculator and a legal pad because we couldn't afford software. I want to be honest with you, for the first 8 years, the company was hers more than mine. I drove routes. She built relationships, negotiated contracts, learned the freight brokerage business by making cold calls until her voice went hoarse. When we finally had enough to buy our second truck, I quit my job and came to work for my own wife. That's not a sentence a lot of men say out loud, but I'm not ashamed of it. I was proud of her. I still am. By the time our son Bradley was born, we had 6 trucks. By the time our daughter Vanessa came along, we had a warehouse in Toledo and contracts with 2 regional grocery chains. Diane ran the business side. I ran operations, dispatch, maintenance, driver relations, the parts of the company that don't show up on a balance sheet, but that keep the wheels turning. Literally. We built something together, brick by brick, decade by decade, and we raised 2 kids in a house that always smelled like coffee and diesel fuel, and later, like the good candles Diane liked once we could afford them. I'll tell you something about grief that nobody prepares you for. It doesn't announce itself. Diane got the diagnosis on a Tuesday in March, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, the kind of thing where the doctor's face tells you everything before he opens his mouth. She was gone by August. 5 months. 5 months to watch the woman who built an empire out of a leased box truck get smaller and quieter in a hospital bed. Until the machines were doing more work than she was. I held her hand when she went. I want you to understand that, because everything that happened after only makes sense once you know I was already hollowed out before my children ever said a word to me. The funeral was at St. Bartholomew's, the church where we got married 36 years earlier. 300 people came, business partners, drivers who'd worked for us for 20 years, half the Toledo Chamber of Commerce. I stood at the front in a suit that suddenly felt 2 sizes too big, shaking hands, saying thank you for coming, thank you for coming, thank you for coming, until the words stopped meaning anything. And through all of it, I watched my son Bradley work the room like it was a networking event. He's 34, sharp-jawed, wears suits that cost more than my first truck did. He runs the commercial side of the business now, or he did. And he spent his mother's funeral reception talking distribution margins with 2 men I didn't recognize. My daughter Vanessa is 31. She handles logistics and fleet acquisitions. She cried at the funeral, I'll give her that. Her tears were real, but by the reception, she'd found her way to the lawyer, a tired, careful man named Gerald Whitfield, who'd handled our family's affairs for 15 years, and I watched them have a conversation with their heads bent close together that made the hair on my arm stand up. The reading of the will happened 4 days later, in Gerald's office on the 9th floor of a building downtown that Diane herself had helped negotiate the lease for years ago, back when we were expanding into commercial real estate holdings. I sat in a leather chair across from my own children, like a stranger waiting for a verdict. Gerald read it plainly, the way lawyers do. No drama in his voice, which somehow made it worse. Diane had left the entirety of Kessler Freight Solutions, the operating company, $42 million in assessed value, including real estate holdings, fleet assets, and active contracts to Bradley and Vanessa split evenly. To me, her husband of 36 years, she left what the document called personal effects, which turned out to be a shoebox that had been sitting in the bottom drawer of her office desk. Gerald handed it to me almost apologetically. Bradley didn't wait for the room to clear before he started talking numbers with Gerald about transition timelines. Vanessa asked, not unkindly, but not gently either, whether I had made any plans for where I'd be living once the estate settled, since the house was titled to the company for tax purposes and the company was, as of that morning, entirely theirs. I asked to see the will again. I asked if there'd been an amendment, a codicil, anything more recent. Gerald hesitated in a way I clocked even through the fog of my own grief, and said the will I was hearing was the most current one on file. He didn't quite meet my eyes when he said it. I didn't understand that hesitation yet. I would. I drove to a Motel 6 that night because I genuinely did not know where else to go. My own house, the house I'd painted, the porch I'd rebuilt after the derecho in 2012, the kitchen table where Diane had done our first year of bookkeeping belonged to a company that belonged to my children now, and neither of them had thought to say, Dad, stay as long as you need. That's when I opened the shoebox properly, alone, on a bedspread with cigarette burns in it, 40 minutes outside the town I'd lived in for 30 years. Photographs our wedding, the kids as babies, the first truck with a hand-painted logo Diane did herself with a stencil kit from the hardware store. And taped to the bottom of the box, underneath a layer of cardboard I almost threw out without checking, was a small brass key and a folded index card in Diane's handwriting. An address in Millersburg, Ohio. Underneath it, 4 words. For the man who stayed. I didn't sleep that night. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. I drove to Millersburg 3 days later. It's Amish country, rolling farmland, an hour and a half from Toledo, someplace I had no memory of Diane ever mentioning. The address led me to a modest storage facility on the edge of town, the kind with a gravel lot and a manager who works out of a double-wide trailer. The key opened Unit 114. Inside was a filing cabinet, a safe, and a banker's box labeled in Diane's handwriting, Walter, open this first. I want to walk you through what I found, because it matters, and because I think a lot of you watching this have wondered, at some point in your life, whether the people you love actually see you. 12 years earlier, Diane had quietly restructured the ownership of Kessler Freight Solutions. Not the operating company Bradley and Vanessa now controlled. That part was real. That part was theirs. The will hadn't lied about that. But the land. Every warehouse, every distribution facility, every parcel the company operated on, sat on ground owned by a separate holding entity called Millersburg Land Trust, LLC. Diane had created it after a legal scare in 2014, when a competitor tried to bankrupt a rival firm through a hostile lawsuit that targeted physical assets. She told me about it in general terms back then. Asset protection, she called it, keeping the land separate from the operating risk, and I trusted her business instincts the way I always had, without asking for details, because that was our arrangement. She ran the strategy. I ran the trucks. What I hadn't known, what the folder in that storage unit explained in Diane's own handwritten notes clipped to the legal documents, was that she had made me the sole trustee and sole beneficiary of that trust. Not the kids, me. Every warehouse, every acre of real estate the company operated from, every square foot Bradley and Vanessa now believed they'd inherited free and clear. They didn't own the ground under their own trucks. I did. There was a letter in the folder too, dated the year she set the trust up, sealed in an envelope with my name on it. I'm not going to pretend I read it without my hands shaking. She wrote that she loved our children fiercely, but she'd watched something curdle in both of them over the years, an entitlement that worried her, a way of talking about the business like it existed to serve them rather than the other way around. She wrote that she didn't know how it would play out, whether they'd grow out of it or grow into it, but she wanted to make sure that whatever happened, I would never be without a floor to stand on. She wrote that I'd given up my own ambitions to build hers, and she never forgot it, even when she didn't always say it. She wrote, "If they've forgotten what you sacrificed, this will remind them. If they haven't, you'll never need to use it." I sat in that storage unit for 2 hours. I won't tell you I wasn't angry at first, because I was angry that she hadn't told me while she was alive. Angry that I'd spent 11 days homeless and humiliated when I was, on paper, the man who owned the land under a $42 million company. But the anger passed, and underneath it was something closer to being seen. My wife had spent the last conscious years of her life quietly building a floor under my feet in case the two people we raised together ever forgot who I was. I didn't do anything right away. I want you to understand that. I wasn't looking for a fight. I called Gerald Whitfield the following Monday, and I could hear in the pause after I said the words Millersburg Land Trust that he already knew Diane had used him to draft it, sworn him to confidence until I found it myself, which explained his hesitation in the will reading. He told me, carefully, that the trust documents were airtight, that Diane had been meticulous, and that legally, my children's company was currently operating out of facilities it did not own and had no lease agreement for, because the internal paperwork had simply carried forward an old informal arrangement that predated the trust creation. In plain English, my son and daughter had inherited a business that was, as of that morning, trespassing. I still didn't act. 3 more weeks passed. I moved out of the Motel 6 into a small rental house near my sister's place, started sleeping again, started eating meals that weren't gas station sandwiches. And in that time, I watched quietly, from a distance, the way you watch weather roll in as Bradley and Vanessa began making decisions that told me everything about who they'd become without me in the room to stop them. They started talking about unlocking value. That was Bradley's phrase, the one he used with a private equity contact he'd met at some logistics conference in Nashville. Kessler Freight Solutions was cash-heavy, but the kids wanted more. Faster, Vanessa wanted to expand into 3 new states. Bradley wanted to take on debt to acquire a smaller competitor in Indiana. Neither of them, from what I could gather through mutual contacts and old drivers who still called me out of loyalty, had the patience their mother built the company with. They wanted the version of success that photographs well. The trouble started the way. Trouble in a family business always starts with pressure nobody wants to name out loud. Bradley had personally guaranteed a business loan to cover the Indiana acquisition, using company assets as collateral, assets he believed the company fully owned. Vanessa, trying to move fast on the multi-state expansion, signed off on new warehouse leases in Kentucky and Pennsylvania that assumed uninterrupted use of the existing Ohio and Michigan facilities as collateral for financing. They were leveraging ground they didn't actually own, because nobody had bothered to check the deed history. Because why would you check the deed history on land your family has operated on for 25 years? 6 weeks after the funeral, their bank's underwriting team ran a routine title search as part of finalizing the Indiana acquisition loan. That's when it came apart. The title search revealed that 4 of the 6 primary warehouse properties were held by an entity called Millersburg Land Trust, LLC, with no recorded lease agreement, no easement, nothing but decades of informal, unwritten use. The bank froze the loan immediately. Their existing operating line of credit, which had covenants tied to clear title on collateral properties, was suddenly in technical default. I got the call from Bradley on a Thursday evening. It was the first time he'd called me since the will reading. His voice had a register I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager who'd wrecked my truck, that particular blend of fear and forced casualness. He said there'd been some kind of paperwork mix-up with the warehouses, some old trust thing tied to Mom's estate planning, and did I know anything about a Millersburg Land Trust? I told him I did. I told him I was the trustee. I told him I was the sole beneficiary. There was a long silence on the line. Then he asked, and I remember this word for word because it told me everything. So what do you want? Not Dad, can we talk? Not I'm sorry. What do you want? Like I was a vendor he needed to negotiate a rate with. I told him I wanted to meet in person, all 3 of us, at Gerald's office the following week. I'm not going to walk you through every hour of the week between that call and the meeting, but I'll tell you it was the loneliest and clearest week of my life. Lonely because I understood by then that whatever affection my children had for me had been conditional in ways I hadn't let myself see while Diane was alive, buffering the relationship, translating me to them and them to me the way she'd always done. Clear, because for the first time since August, I wasn't confused about what I needed to do next. They arrived at Gerald's office together, and I could see it on both their faces. The moment they walked in, the particular exhaustion of people who've spent a week discovering that panic doesn't actually solve anything. Vanessa had lost weight. Bradley's suit, the same kind of suit he'd worn to his mother's funeral, looked like it had been slept in. Gerald laid it out plainly, the way he had the will. The company was in technical default on its primary line of credit due to the collateral issue. The Indiana acquisition loan was dead. 2 of the new lease agreements in Kentucky and Pennsylvania had cancellation clauses that would trigger significant penalties if the company couldn't demonstrate operational stability within 30 days, meaning clear title or a binding lease on their existing facilities. Without access to the Ohio and Michigan warehouses, Kessler Freight Solutions could not fulfill its existing distribution contracts, which meant the $42 million company they'd inherited was, within a matter of weeks, at real risk of losing its two largest grocery chain contracts and defaulting on debt obligations that Bradley had personally guaranteed. Vanessa spoke first. She said, and her voice cracked doing it, that she didn't understand why I hadn't just told them, right after the funeral, that I owned the land. She said it felt cruel, letting them find out this way, letting the company nearly collapse before saying anything. I let that sit in the room for a moment before I answered her. I told her I didn't know I owned the land until 11 days after their mother died, because I'd been left a shoebox of photographs and told to figure out my own living situation while they discussed transition timelines over her casket. I told her that nobody in that will reading had asked me a single question about how I was doing, only what my plans were for vacating a house I'd lived in for 30 years. I told her I understood now, sitting in that office, that they had genuinely believed their mother built that company alone, and that I was some kind of legacy hire who happened to also be their father, because that was the story they'd apparently told themselves, and I hadn't corrected it in time because I was too busy grieving the woman who actually knew the truth. Bradley tried a different approach. He offered me a monthly consulting stipend, $2,000, he said, generous. Given that I'd been somewhat removed from daily operations in recent years, in exchange for a long-term lease agreement on the trust properties at below-market rates, backdated to cover the gap, so the bank would restore the credit line and the acquisition could move forward. I asked him if he remembered driving with me when he was 9 years old, riding along on a Toledo to Cincinnati run because his mother needed a Saturday to catch up on invoicing, and he'd asked me why I didn't run the company since I was the one who actually knew how the trucks worked. I told him I remembered exactly what I said back then, which was that a business isn't the trucks, it's the trust. And his mother had built more trust in 15 years than most people build in a lifetime. I told him I didn't think he understood that sentence yet, even now, 34 years old, sitting across from me trying to backdate a lease. I declined the stipend. What I offered instead, and I want to be clear, I thought about this for a long time before that meeting, and it wasn't about punishment. Whatever the two of them accused me of in the parking lot afterward was a fair, standard market rate commercial lease on the Ohio and Michigan properties, structured as a normal landlord-tenant relationship with the same terms any other property owner would offer. No discount, no favor. I told them I would also step back into an active operational role, not as a favor to them, but because the company had been my life's work too, whatever the will said, and I still had 30 years of relationships with drivers and dispatchers and warehouse managers who trusted me. I told them I wasn't interested in taking the company from them. I was interested in making sure it survived, and in making sure that surviving it meant actually earning it the way their mother and I had. Vanessa asked quietly whether this meant I forgave them. I told her forgiveness and trust are two different things, and that I could offer her the first without pretending I already had the second. I told her trust gets rebuilt the way the company was originally built, slowly, through years of showing up, not through a single meeting in a lawyer's office. They signed the lease. The bank restored the credit line within days, once the title issue was resolved and documented. The Indiana acquisition went forward, more conservatively than Bradley had originally planned, because I sat in on the negotiations this time and insisted on terms that didn't leverage every asset the company had. The Kentucky and Pennsylvania expansions proceeded on a longer timeline, one warehouse at a time instead of 3 at once, which Vanessa resisted at first and later. Months in, admitted was the only reason the company wasn't drowning in debt service by winter. I moved back into operations, not into the house. I stayed in my rental near my sister's, and honestly, I've come to like the quiet of it, the way I get to decide what's on the walls. I go into the Toledo warehouse 3 mornings a week now. I know every dispatcher's name, same as I always did. Bradley calls me before he makes major decisions now, not because the lease requires it, but because the last time he didn't, it nearly cost him everything he thought he already owned. 6 months after that meeting in Gerald's office, Vanessa asked me to come to Sunday dinner at her place, just the two of us, no business talk. I almost said no. I went anyway. She'd made a pot roast that came out dry, and we laughed about it. actually laughed. For the first time since her mother's funeral, and at the end of the night she asked me if I still had the shoebox of photographs. I told her I did. I told her I looked at it most weeks. She asked if she could see them sometime. I said I'd like that. I think about what Diane wrote in that letter more than I think about almost anything else these days. If they've forgotten what you sacrificed, this will remind them. If they haven't, you'll never need to use it. I did have to use it. I don't know if that means my children had forgotten who I was, or if they'd simply never been taught to see me clearly in the first place. Diane was always the one who explained me to them, the translator between the guy who fixed the trucks and the woman who built the empire, and maybe I let that go on too long without learning to speak for myself. But I'll tell you what I've come to believe, 61 years old, standing in a warehouse at 6 in the morning with a coffee that's gone cold because I got talking to a driver about his kid's Little League game. Love that only shows up when it's convenient isn't love. It's convenience wearing love's clothes. What my children offered me at that will, reading a monthly allowance, a quiet exit, a life that fit neatly around the edges of theirs, wasn't cruelty exactly. I don't think either of them woke up that morning intending to be cruel. It was something quieter and more common than cruelty. It was forgetting. They forgot that the man in the corner of the room, the one they'd stopped really looking at somewhere around their college years, had built the floor they were standing on, sometimes literally. I didn't win anything, in the end, that I take pride in the way you might expect. I didn't get to watch my children lose everything and grovel for scraps. That's not this story. And honestly, I don't think that story would have taught either of them anything worth learning. What I got was the chance to remind two people I love, in the only language they were fluent enough to hear at that moment in their lives, that respect isn't inherited. It's paid, on time, every month, in ways that have nothing to do with money and everything to do with whether you see the people who built what you're standing on. If you've ever had to make the people you love earn their way back to you, instead of just handing forgiveness over because you miss them, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if any part of tonight's story sat with you the way I hope it did, do an old man a favor and hit that subscribe button. I've got more of these to tell you.